Welcome to the History Maps podcast. Consider the year 1205. You are standing on the thick, heavily fortified stone walls of one of the most advanced cities on Earth.
Right, and inside those walls, you have these incredibly complex bureaucratic systems.
Exactly. You've got explosive gunpowder rockets, a massive professional standing army, and, enough grain stored to last for decades.
You belong to a society that has completely mastered hydraulic engineering, literature, maritime trade, all of it.
Yeah, all of it. But looking out from those walls, you are about to be attacked and eventually conquered.
By an army of nomadic herdsmen from the desert steppe.
Right, herdsmen who just a few decades prior didn't even have a centralized government, let alone the engineering knowledge to build a simple siege ladder.
It completely defies our conventional understanding of how empires expand, if you think about it.
Well, absolutely.
We're so conditioned to think that the society with the most advanced technology, the highest population, the deepest pockets, that they always win a war of attrition.
But the historical reality we are unpacking today shatters that assumption entirely.
It really does.
So the mission of this deep dive is to trace exactly how that happened. We're exploring the 74-year military, technological, and political evolution that allowed the Mongol Empire to conquer China.
And we are talking about a sprawling timeline here, from 1205 all the way to 1279.
Yeah. We're synthesizing historical texts, military encyclopedias, regional chronicles to figure out the exact mechanisms, the how and the why.
Right, how a nomadic steppe force systematically dismantled the most sophisticated agrarian societies on the planet and ultimately established the Yuan dynasty.
And doing that, well, it requires us to look far beyond the battlefield. Because if you just study military history casually, the popular image of the Mongols is often just...
Like an unstoppable wave.
Yeah, an unstoppable monolithic wave of light cavalry sweeping across the plains.
Winning through sheer terror and speed.
Yeah.
But when you actually look at the primary sources, this conquest was a slow, grueling masterclass.
In tactical adaptation, right?
Exactly. Tactical adaptation, psychological manipulation, and the exploitation of deep, pre-existing political fractures.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before the Mongols could even attempt to conquer China, we have to understand that the concept of China as a single, unified political entity, it simply didn't exist at the dawn of the 13th century.
No, not at all. The region was a deeply divided, highly hostile geopolitical landscape.
It was incredibly fractured.
That is the critical foundation of this entire history. I mean, if you look at a map of the region prior to 1205, you're looking at a quadripartite structure.
4 major distinct powers.
Right, occupying the territory we now associate with modern China. Up in the north, covering the vast northern plains down to the Huai River, you had the Jurchen dynasty.
And they had previously overthrown the Khitan Liao dynasty to take that territory, right?
Correct. Then, over in the northwest, occupying the vital Hexi corridor, which was, the main artery of the Silk Road, you had the Tangnit Western Jia.
Okay, so that's 2. And then moving south.
To the south, controlling the incredibly prosperous, heavily populated Yangtze River Valley was the Southern Song dynasty.
Right.
And finally, nestled deep in the mountainous, heavily forested southwest, was the Dali Kingdom.
So if we use an analogy here, the geopolitical situation was essentially a complex multiplayer board game.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
You have the Jin, the Song, the Xia, and the Dali. And from the sources, it seems like these established players were just so completely consumed by taxing each other.
And fighting over border disputes?
Right, and managing their own internal political factions that they entirely ignored a new player quietly hoarding resources on the far edges of the board.
They absolutely ignored the threat, largely out of this deeply ingrained sense of cultural superiority.
They just didn't take the Mongols seriously.
Not at all. The established powers were locked in a generational cycle of mutual hostilities. Take the Jin and the Song, for example.
Yeah, their history is intense.
It is. The Song dynasty had actually controlled the north previously, but they were brutally pushed south by the Jin in 1127.
Right, leading to those massive peace treaties.
Exactly. Treaties that forced the Song to pay huge annual indemnities to the Jin. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of ounces of silver and bolts of silk delivered every single year.
I mean, that level of forced tribute guarantees deep institutional animosity.
Oh, absolutely.
It meant there was zero chance the Song and the Jin were going to form some kind of unified, allied front against a new external threat.
Zero chance. And the Southern Song had their own systemic vulnerabilities, too. They had a profound institutional reliance on civil bureaucracy.
And they actively suppressed military reform, didn't they?
They did. They had learned from previous dynasties that powerful autonomous generals often launched internal coups, like the massive Aleutian Rebellion centuries earlier.
All right.
So the Song government feared their own military commanders far more than they feared external enemies.
That's a huge strategic flaw.
It paralyzed them. They deliberately kept their military decentralized and tightly controlled by civilian administrators, which of course severely limited their ability to project force.
And meanwhile, the Jin dynasty in the north was directly bordering the steppe. They had a long, violent history of interacting with the nomadic tribes, including the Mongols.
Yes, they did.
But it wasn't a relationship of mutual respect, was it?
Not in the slightest. I mean, the Jin viewed the steppe nomads as a nuisance, something to be managed through cruelty, bribery, and manipulation.
Right.
The Jin government historically abstracted tribute from the Mongol tribes and intentionally played different confederations against each other.
Keep them fighting each other so they don't fight you.
Exactly. They funded rival chieftains to ensure no single leader could ever unite the steppe. On top of that, the Jin conducted regular, brutal, punitive expeditions into the grasslands.
Yeah, there's a specific euphemism they used in their records for that, right?
Yeah, reducing the numbers. Jin cavalry would ride into the steppes specifically to kill fighting-age men and enslave the women and children.
Strictly to keep the population down.
Strictly for population control.
There is a very specific, visceral incident in the sources that illustrates exactly how sadistic this relationship was. The Jin captured a prominent Mongol leader named Ambakai.
Yes.
And they didn't just execute him, they nailed him alive to a wooden mule.
It's horrifying.
It was a highly calculated public display of agonizing torture meant to humiliate the nomads and terrify them into submission.
But if you look at the timeline, that single act of cruelty just planted a massive seed of multi-generational vengeance.
It absolutely did.
And this is where the arrogance of the sedentary states became their fatal flaw. They continued to treat the nomads as disorganized barbarians who just needed to be occasionally disciplined.
Entirely failing to recognize the monumental political shift happening right on their borders.
Right, because Genghis Khan was actively unifying the steppe tribes. He was turning a fractured group of herdsmen into a highly disciplined, meritocratic military machine.
But because the Jin, Song, and Xia were so deeply divided, Genghis Khan had the luxury of time.
He did. He didn't have to launch a massive, all-encompassing invasion of the whole region on day one.
He looked at that fractured board game, and he decided to test his new military by probing the weakest link.
Which brings us to the Western Xia.
Right, situated in the northwest, controlling those lucrative trade routes.
Genghis Khan essentially used them as a live-fire testing ground. Between 1205 and 1209, he initiated a series of probing raids into Western Xia territory.
And he used a very thin political pretext for this, didn't he?
Very thin. He claimed he was searching for a rival named Nilka Sengam, who had supposedly fled across the border.
But functionally, he was testing their response times.
Exactly. Evaluating garrison strength, plundering border settlements to enrich his followers.
And those early raids proved that the newly unified Mongol cavalry was dominant in open field skirmishes.
Completely dominant. But when Genghis Khan escalated to a full-scale invasion in 1209, the Mongols hit a massive logistical and technological wall.
Because of the cities.
Right. They advanced to the Western Xia capital of Yinchuan, which was defended by a heavily fortified garrison of roughly 150,000 men.
And the Mongols at this point were almost entirely a light cavalry force.
They were just archers on horseback. They possessed absolutely zero engineering knowledge for siege warfare. They didn't have trebuchets, they didn't have siege towers. They barely had ladders.
Wait, if you are an army of guys on horses with bows and arrows, how do you even attempt to breach massive stone walls?
Yeah.
I mean, you can't just shoot arrows at rocks.
You can't. And their first major attempt at a siege illustrates just how steep their learning curve was.
At Yinchuan in 1209.
Yeah. The Mongols realized they couldn't breach the walls, so they tried to use the environment against the city.
They noticed the Yellow River flowed nearby.
Right, and they decided to build a massive dike to divert the river's flow, intending to completely flood the capital and wash out the defenders.
I mean, in theory, that is a brilliant tactical pivot.
In theory, yes. But in practice, hydraulic engineering requires precise mathematical calculations regarding water pressure, soil integrity, flow rates.
which they didn't have.
Not at all. The Mongols forced captive laborers to build the dike, but they lacked the engineering expertise to construct it properly.
So what happened?
The massive hydraulic pressure of the diverted Yellow River was too much for the earthen walls they had built. The dikes catastrophically collapsed.
Oh, man.
But instead of flooding the city of Yinchuan, the water rushed the wrong way and completely flooded the Mongols' own camp.
They literally washed themselves out.
They did. It was an embarrassing engineering failure.
But the crucial takeaway is how the Western Xia responded.
Yes. Despite the Mongols practically drowning themselves, the Western Xia emperor looked around for help. He appealed to the Jin dynasty for military relief.
And the Jin emperor refused.
Perfectly happy to watch two rivals bleed each other.
Right. So isolated, and realizing the Mongols were not going to just leave, the Western Xia emperor submitted.
He became a vassal to Genghis Khan, offering massive tribute in camels, falcons, textiles, and he even gave his daughter in marriage to the Khan.
But reading through the timeline, that vassalage was incredibly unstable. The real reckoning for the Western Xia came later.
And it was triggered by a profound betrayal.
The dynamic shifted drastically a few years later.
Right. The Mongols were preparing for a massive, multi-front campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire far to the west in Central Asia.
And as a vassal state, the Western Xia were obligated to provide auxiliary troops for this campaign.
Genghis Khan sent envoys demanding their military support. But the Western Xia court, recognizing that the main Mongol army would be thousands of miles away, essentially mocked the envoys.
Yeah, they sent a message back saying if Genghis Khan does not have enough troops on his own, he has no business calling himself the supreme ruler.
They flatly refused to send a single soldier.
And not only did they refuse, but while Genghis Khan was fighting in Central Asia, the Western Xia actively tried to form a coalition with the Jin and the Song to attack the Mongols' eastern flank.
Which was a direct violation of their treaty. And a massive strategic threat.
I mean, Genghis Khan was fighting a brutal war in the west, and his vassals in the east were plotting a betrayal.
He swore total vengeance. The moment he returned from the Khwarezmian campaign in 1225, he gathered his forces and launched a punitive war against the Western Xia.
But this wasn't just a war of subjugation.
No, this was an extermination campaign.
And the geography of this campaign is staggering. The Western Xia commanders couldn't just march their armies out to meet the Mongols on the border, because doing so meant crossing roughly 500 kilometers of the Gobi Desert.
Exactly. The environment dictated the strategy, and the Mongols had a distinct advantage here.
Let's talk about that advantage.
To understand the Mongol military machine, you have to look at their logistics. Maintaining an army of roughly 180,000 men in a harsh desert environment, that's a nightmare for a traditional agrarian military.
Right, because they would need massive, slow-moving supply trains of ox-drawn carts carrying grain.
Which are highly vulnerable to attack, and they require their own massive amounts of forage.
So how did the Mongols solve that?
By relying entirely on the steppe pony. Each Mongol warrior rode with a string of 3 to 5 remounts.
So when one horse grew tired,
the warrior would literally leap to a fresh horse while in motion, allowing the army to cover immense distances at high speed without resting.
That's incredible endurance.
But more importantly, the horses were the supply train. The warriors survived on dried meat, yogurt, and heavily relied on the milk from the mares.
And in desperate situations.
In desperate situations in the desert, a Mongol rider would open a small vein in the horse's neck, drink a small amount of blood to sustain himself, and then close the vein, allowing the horse to recover.
That is intense.
It meant the Mongol army had no cumbersome supply lines to protect. They were completely self-sufficient and highly mobile in terrain that would starve a Chinese army.
And that level of mobility culminated in late 1226 at the Battle of the Yellow River,
where the Western Xia finally committed to a massive open field engagement.
They fielded an army of roughly 300,000 troops, and the Mongols absolutely dismantled them.
The sources describe the frozen river being completely covered in bodies.
They shattered the entire military capacity of the Western Xia state in a single engagement. But right as the campaign was reaching its conclusion, a monumental event occurred.
Yes. In August 1227, Genghis Khan died.
The primary sources are notoriously vague and contradictory about the exact cause, aren't they?
They are. Some suggest he succumbed to injuries from falling off his horse during a hunt. Others mention a prolonged illness, like typhus.
And some regional myths even claim he was assassinated by a captive princess.
Whatever the cause, the Mongol High Command kept his death an absolute secret.
because they understood that if the Western Shia realized the Great Khan was dead, it would embolden them to fight on.
Or it might trigger a succession crisis within the Mongol ranks before the campaign was finished.
So the war machine ground forward without missing a beat.
By September 1227, the last Western Shia emperor, entirely unaware of Genghis Khan's death, finally surrendered the besieged capital of Yinchuan.
And the Mongol response was merciless.
Following the strict orders Genghis Khan had laid out before his death, the Mongols executed the emperor and his entire family.
They pillaged Jinchuan, systematically slaughtered the civilian population, and plundered the imperial tombs of the Western Shia rulers.
They effectively erased the state from the map.
So, stepping back from the immediate brutality, what did this campaign achieve strategically for the Mongols?
It served two vital purposes. First, geographically, it secured their western flank.
Meaning when they turned east toward the Jin, no one was behind them.
Exactly. There would be no hostile army left to cut off their retreat or attack their homelands. Second, and perhaps more importantly, it was a massive learning experience.
Going back to that flooded camp at Yinchuan.
Right. That disaster proved to the Mongol leadership that while their cavalry tactics were invincible on the open steppe, they possessed a critical, glaring deficit in siege engineering.
A technological gap they aggressively set out to close.
Which brings us directly to the war with the Jin dynasty.
With the western border completely secure, the Mongols could finally focus entirely on their historical oppressors in the north.
And the diplomatic incident that kicked off this war, it's just wild. It shows how out of touch the Jin leadership was.
The Jin emperor, Wanyanji, sent an envoy to the Mongols demanding that Genghis Khan formally submit to him as a vassal.
And when the envoy delivered this demand, Genghis Khan reportedly spat on the ground in disgust.
And when the envoy returned and told the Jin emperor what happened, Wanyanji was furious.
He dismissed the Mongol threat entirely. He famously stated, "Our empire is like the sea, yours is but a handful of sand."
It's striking, honestly. The Jin had been receiving reports of the Mongols destroying entire armies, yet they still fundamentally viewed them through this outdated lens of disorganized, squabbling tribes.
That quote perfectly encapsulates the sedentary world's fatal misunderstanding of the steppe. The Jin thought their massive population, towering walls, and deep reserves of wealth made them an ocean that could easily swallow a handful of sand.
So Genghis Khan formally declared war, and in 1211, the Mongols launched a massive invasion across the border.
And the early field battles quickly demonstrated exactly how a highly disciplined cavalry force dismantles a traditional standing army.
The defining engagement of this early phase is the Battle of Yahuling in September 1211.
Right.
The Jin commanders moved a massive force, estimated between 30,000 and 50,000 troops, to block a critical mountain pass. The terrain favored the defenders.
Heavily favored them.
So how did the Mongols break a heavily defended, entrenched position in a mountain pass?
They utilized a tactic that the steppe nomads had perfected over centuries, the feigned retreat. But it is vital to understand the sheer discipline required to execute this maneuver.
It's not just running away.
No, the Mongols would charge the Jin lines, engage in fierce combat, and then suddenly break formation. They would turn their horses and flee in what looked like absolute chaotic panic.
Sometimes even dropping weapons and supplies to make the route look genuine.
For a Jin commander standing on a hill, seeing the terrifying Mongol horde suddenly break and run, it must have felt like a massive victory.
The psychological temptation to pursue and slaughter a fleeing enemy must be overwhelming.
Exactly, and the Jin troops fell for it. Believing they had broken the Mongol assault, they abandoned their disciplined, fortified defensive lines.
They broke ranks and chased the Mongols out of the pass and into the open terrain.
But a fleeing army loses its cohesion. The Jin soldiers became strung out, exhausted, and disorganized over miles of pursuit.
And in the trap springs.
Once the Mongols drew them far enough away from their defensive positions, a signal was given. The fleeing Mongol cavalry flawlessly wheeled their horses around in unison.
And they enveloped the exhausted, disorganized Jin troops from the flanks.
Unleashing a relentless barrage of arrows, it turned from a pursuit into an absolute slaughter.
The tactical brilliance of Yahuling completely shattered the main Jin field armies. It allowed the Mongols to pour through the mountain passes and directly into the central plains of northern China.
But defeating an army in the field is one thing. The Jin still possessed a network of massive, heavily fortified, densely populated cities.
This is where the lessons from the Western Xia come into play.
Right. By 1213, the Mongols had advanced to the Jin central capital of Zhongdu, which is located exactly where modern-day Beijing sits.
And this was a true imperial metropolis, protected by massive walls, deep moats, tens of thousands of defenders.
But the Mongols didn't just sit outside the walls on their horses this time. Genghis Khan had issued orders to capture every Chinese engineer, artisan, and laborer they encountered during their advance.
They were essentially kidnapping human capital.
Precisely. The Mongols conscripted these captured experts and forced them to build siege engines right outside the walls of Zhongdu.
Catapults, trebuchets, scaling ladders, battering rams.
They combined this new engineering capacity with their traditional tactic of total blockade. They cut off every supply road leading into the city.
They starved the population. Disease ran rampant through the packed, starving civilians inside.
The psychological and physical pressure became intolerable. By 1215, the Jin government capitulated and sued for peace,
offering vast amounts of gold, silk, thousands of horses, and the Jin emperor even handed over a royal princess, Kiguo, to become one of Genghis Khan's wives.
But the Jin emperor didn't trust the peace. As soon as the Mongols pulled back slightly, he made a desperate strategic decision.
He evacuated his court and moved his capital far to the south, to the city of Taifing.
Placing the Yellow River between himself and the Mongols.
Moving the capital was a tacit admission that the Jin had lost the north. From that moment on, they were fighting a strictly defensive war of survival.
And this conflict dragged on for decades. It outlasted Genghis Khan, who died in 1227.
So the prosecution of the war fell to his successor, his son, Ögedei Khan.
Ögedei was determined to finish what his father started. Between 1230 and 1234, he launched the final campaigns to eradicate the Jin.
And once again, we see the Mongols manipulating the geopolitical map to their advantage, because the Jin defenses along the Yellow River were formidable.
Very formidable. So the Mongols, led by Ögedei's brilliant brother, General Tolui, requested passage through the territory of the Southern Song dynasty.
And the Southern Song, still harboring that deep, bitter hatred for the Jin dynasty that had stolen their northern lands a century earlier, they actually agreed.
They allowed Tolui's army to march through their territory, completely outflanking the massive Jin defensive lines on the river and striking the Jin from the south.
The climax of this entire decades-long conflict happens at the Battle of Sanfingshan in 1232. And the weather played a terrifying role here.
It did. The remnants of the main Jin field army were retreating, desperately trying to regroup, and a sudden, massive snowstorm hit the region.
You have to picture the condition of these Jin soldiers. They had been fighting a losing war for years.
Their supply lines were shattered, they were severely malnourished, lacking proper winter clothing, and their morale was just non-existent.
When the snowstorm hit, they were immobilized.
The historical records describe the cold being so severe that the soldiers could barely hold their weapons, and their faces went as pale as corpses.
And the Mongols, rather than charging in and fighting hand-to-hand in the snow, used incredible psychological pressure.
They completely surrounded the freezing Jin army, but they deliberately left one small, obvious escape route unguarded.
It is a textbook psychological trap.
Right, because when an army is surrounded and believes they are going to die, they will fight with the ferocity of cornered animals. The casualty rate for the attacking force will be massive.
But if you give a freezing, starving, terrified soldier a clear path to simply run away and live,
the instinct for self-preservation takes over. The Jin troops broke formation and surged toward that escape route.
And the moment they dropped their guard and focused entirely on fleeing, the Mongols ambushed the route.
They wiped out the entire remaining Jin command structure with minimal losses to their own forces.
That victory destroyed the last field army the Jin could muster. The Mongols then laid siege to the final, desperate stronghold at Kaizu.
In February 1234,
As the Mongol forces finally breached the walls and poured into the city, the last Jin emperor, Aizong, realized all was lost.
he abdicated the throne to a general and then immediately committed suicide by hanging himself.
The Jurchen Jin dynasty was officially extinguished.
But there is a crucial element to this conquest that we really need to analyze. We talk about the Mongol war machine, but the armies conducting these final sieges, the armies holding the blockades, they weren't entirely comprised of Mongol cavalrymen.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the sources detail massive, widespread defections. You have powerful Han Chinese and Khitan generals, men like Shi Tianze and Shimo Ming'an, who didn't just casually switch sides to save their own skin.
No, the Mongols gave them command of entire tumens.
A tumen is a military unit of 10,000 men. Why were established Chinese generals so willing to fight for a foreign nomadic power against their own rulers?
What's compelling here is that it comes down to pragmatism and the difference in how the two societies functioned.
How so?
The Jin dynasty had a rigid, ethnically biased hierarchy where Jurchen elites held the highest honors. Han Chinese commanders often hit a very hard ceiling in terms of advancement.
Oh, I see.
The Mongols, conversely, operated as a strict meritocracy on the battlefield. Genghis Khan and his successors did not care what god you prayed to or what language you spoke.
As long as you possessed a skill that advanced the empire and you demonstrated absolute loyalty.
Exactly. So if you were a brilliant Chinese siege engineer or a talented infantry commander under the Jin, your career might be stalled.
But if you defected to the Mongols,
They would immediately recognize your utility, promote you, give you wealth, and put you in charge.
the Mongols aggressively integrated these defectors.
They didn't just absorb them into the ranks. They fundamentally restructured their military to optimize these new assets. They formed specialized units.
Like the Black Army.
Right. The Black Army was primarily composed of Han Chinese defectors who specialized in siege warfare and holding territory. Later, they instituted a massive new army consisting of tens of thousands of conscripted infantrymen.
Because they understood a fundamental truth about imperial expansion.
A pure cavalry force can conquer a city, but it takes infantry, engineers, and administrators to hold it.
They rewarded those with specialized skills physicians, metallurgists, craftsmen, with immense privileges, while mercilessly slaughtering anyone who resisted.
They weaponized the talent of the conquered against the unconquered.
Okay, so let's look at the map in 1234. The Jin are destroyed. The Western Xia are gone. The Mongols now control the entirety of northern China,
They possess a massive, highly experienced, multi-ethnic army.
and they are sitting on vast, sprawling stretches of agricultural land filled with millions of peasant farmers.
Which brings the Mongol leadership to a monumental crossroads. It was an existential crisis of identity for the empire.
Because the traditional, deeply ingrained nomadic approach to conquered territory was simple, right?
Very simple. You kill or enslave the inhabitants, you flatten the cities, you destroy the agricultural infrastructure.
And you let the wild grasses grow back to turn the region into endless pasture land for your horse herds.
Right. And reading the sources, there were powerful traditionalist Mongol generals sitting in the war councils fiercely advocating for exactly that.
They viewed the Chinese peasants merely as a physical obstacle blocking prime grazing land. They wanted to wipe the slate clean.
But this is the moment where the administrative brilliance of the Mongol Empire takes center stage, and it revolves around a single, highly influential figure.
Yelu Chukai.
Yes, a captured Khitan Confucian scholar. He had been serving the Jin dynasty, was captured by the Mongols at Zhongdu, and eventually became the chief administrative advisor to Ugadai Khan.
How does a captured scholar stand in a tent full of hardened Mongol warlords and convince them not to slaughter millions of people?
By speaking a language they understood, wealth and power.
He didn't appeal to their morality.
No. Yelu Chukai didn't appeal to their mercy, he appealed to their pragmatism. He famously told Ugadai Khan, "You can conquer an empire on horseback, but you cannot govern it on horseback."
That's a powerful statement.
He argued that if they exterminated the peasantry, they would get a one-time plunder of wealth, and then the land would just be grass.
But if they kept the peasants alive, protected them, and implemented a systematic, bureaucratic method of taxation,
Those peasants would generate an endless, massive stream of silver, grain, silk, and weapons every single year.
he essentially argued the economic value of a living, producing population over a dead one.
And Ugadai Khan listened. He allowed Yelu Chukai to implement a radically new system.
Because previously, under the initial years of Mongol occupation, the Chinese peasants had suffered under a chaotic system of extraordinary levies. Right.
Exactly. Whenever a Mongol prince or army passed through an area, they would just take whatever they wanted: food, horses, people. It was unpredictable and devastating to the local economy.
Yelu Chukai replaced that chaos with predictability.
He established fixed quotas for taxation. A household knew exactly how much grain and cloth they owed the state each year. He also formalized the system of corvée labor.
Let's explain corvée labor, because it's a critical concept in ancient economies. This isn't just paying money to the government.
Right. Corvée is unpaid, forced labor imposed by the state on its subjects, usually for a specific number of days each year, as a form of taxation.
So instead of paying silver, A peasant would be drafted to spend a month digging canals, building walls, or constructing siege engines for the army.
It was a way for the state to mobilize massive public works projects without spending a single coin.
The Mongols also reorganized the social fabric at the ground level. They instituted a system of rural cooperatives.
They grouped roughly 50 peasant households together into a single administrative unit.
And these cooperatives were given specific responsibilities. They had to manage local agriculture, plant orchards, maintain local flood control systems on the rivers, and conduct localized census tracking.
It functioned ostensibly as a self-help organization to stabilize the rural economy. But functionally, it was a profound mechanism of imperial control.
How so?
It made the local communities collectively responsible for meeting tax quotas. And it served as a deeply embedded surveillance network for the Mongol overseers.
Oh, I see. If one household rebelled.
If one household in the cooperative rebelled or hid resources, the entire cooperative of 50 families would be severely punished. It deterred sabotage through collective liability.
Furthermore, the Mongols fundamentally inverted the traditional Chinese social hierarchy.
This is a major shift. In classic Confucian society, scholars and farmers were highly respected because they produced philosophy and food.
But merchants and artisans were often viewed with deep suspicion.
Right. They were seen as parasites who didn't create anything, but simply moved goods around to make a profit. They were placed at the very bottom of the social ladder.
But the Mongols viewed the world through the lens of logistics and empire.
They highly valued specialized skills, commerce, and the free flow of goods. They immediately elevated the social and legal status of artisans, engineers, and merchants.
They actively sponsored merchant guilds, provided them with military protection, and poured resources into reopening and securing the massive Silk Road networks.
They wanted a vibrant Eurasian-wide exchange of wealth, technology, and information.
So, to synthesize this, the decision to spare the agrarian north is the exact moment the Mongol Empire stopped being purely a nomadic conquest machine and actively transformed into a massive, functioning bureaucratic state.
Yes. They realized they needed the complex administrative architecture of China to efficiently extract the unimaginable wealth required to fund the second half of their conquest.
They were building the economic engine that would eventually allow them to turn south.
And they absolutely needed that engine, because heading south to conquer the Southern Song dynasty presented entirely new, terrifying geographical and strategic challenges.
The Southern Song were protected by the Yangtze River, which functioned as a massive, treacherous natural moat.
The Mongols knew they couldn't just launch a frontal assault across that river with cavalry. They needed to outflank the Song geographically.
And that meant sending armies deep into the rugged, humid, mountainous terrain of the southwest.
This strategy initiated the campaign against the Dali kingdom in 1253. The great Khan Munka dispatched his brother Kublai, who was not yet the great Khan, but an incredibly capable prince, along with a veteran general named Uryankadai.
Their objective was to march through the eastern edges of the Tibetan Plateau and strike Dali.
The geography was brutal. They were entirely out of their element.
The sources have this vivid detail about how they managed to cross the Jinsha River, which is the massive upper reaches of the Yangtze.
It's quite a story.
The river is incredibly turbulent, cutting through deep gorges. You can't swim a horse across it, and they didn't have the timber or the time to build a fleet of wooden transport ships. So how do they cross?
They utilized a brilliant, improvised engineering solution. They slaughtered massive numbers of their sheep, carefully skinned them to keep the hides intact, sealed the openings, and inflated the skins like balloons.
Wait, really?
Yes! They lashed dozens of these inflated sheepskins together to create highly buoyant, flexible rafts.
It sounds absurd, but the physics of it are perfectly sound. An inflated hide displacing water can carry a significant amount of weight.
Exactly. The rafts were lightweight, easy to carry over the mountains, and buoyant enough to transport thousands of heavily armed men in their saddles across a raging river.
What about the horses?
The horses, unburdened by riders or gear, were forced to swim alongside the rafts. It is a striking example of their tactical adaptability. They used the materials of their nomadic lifestyle, their herds, to solve a complex geographical problem.
So they successfully cross the river, navigate the mountains, and eventually reach the capital city of Dali.
And the local ruler, King Duan Xingzi, realizes his situation is hopeless and ultimately surrenders.
But what is truly critical here is how Kublai responds to the surrender.
In almost every previous Mongol campaign, If a city resisted initially and only surrendered when the situation became dire, the standard operating procedure was widespread slaughter, to set an example.
But Kublai's response at Dali was radically different. Why? What changed in his thinking?
Kublai had surrounded himself with highly educated, pragmatic Chinese advisors, men like Yao Shu. These advisors continuously educated Kublai on the tenets of Confucian statecraft and Buddhist compassion.
They argued that a ruler gains true legitimacy not through terror, but through benevolence and stable governance.
Heavily influenced by these concepts, Kublai made a deliberate, calculated choice to spare the city of Dali and its civilian population.
He didn't depose the king either. He kept King Duan Xingzi in power, officially appointing him as a vassal Maharaja.
He essentially gave him Mongol backing to continue governing the region, so long as he swore loyalty and provided troops.
It was a brilliant strategy of co-option rather than annihilation.
By keeping the local administrative structure intact, the Mongols immediately gained access to indigenous troops from Dali. They used these local soldiers, who were adapted to the humid, mountainous terrain and immune to local diseases, to help pacify the rest of the Yunnan region.
This successful flanking maneuver secured the entire southern border of the Song dynasty. The Mongols were now positioned to strike the Song from the north, the west, and the south simultaneously.
They had the Song completely boxed in.
But then, in 1259, the entire relentless momentum of the Mongol Empire across the whole Eurasian continent came to a grinding, chaotic halt.
The reigning Great Khan, Mongke, was personally leading a massive siege against the heavily fortified Diaoyu fortress in the humid Sichuan province. And during this siege, the Great Khan died on the front lines.
The primary sources are fascinatingly divided on what actually killed him.
They are. The environment was a nightmare for the Mongols. The intense heat and humidity bred disease, and some chronicles suggest Mongke contracted cholera or severe dysentery, which ravaged the Mongol camps.
However, other accounts, particularly those sympathetic to the Song defenders, claim that the Great Khan was observing the battle from too close and was struck by a projectile fired from a Song trebuchet.
Dying from the trauma.
Regardless of whether it was a microbe or a rock that killed him, his death triggered an immediate constitutional crisis within the Mongol Empire.
By Mongol tradition, the succession of the Great Khan wasn't strictly hereditary from father to eldest son. It required a Kurultai.
A massive political and military council of all the senior princes and generals.
Right. They had to physically gather in the Mongol heartland to debate, negotiate, and formally elect the new supreme leader.
It is exactly like a massive, globally expanding megacorporation that suddenly, unexpectedly loses its CEO. The central command structure completely dissolves.
All the powerful regional managers, the commanders of the Ilkhanate fighting in the Middle East, the leaders of the Golden Horde advancing into Europe, and Kublai fighting in China, they all immediately halt their campaigns.
They take their armies and pull back, focusing entirely on securing their own regional power bases and maneuvering for the vacant throne.
This sudden withdrawal provided the Southern Song dynasty with an incredible, completely unexpected reprieve. The pressure on their borders vanished almost overnight.
Meanwhile, the Mongol Empire plunged into the Tuluid Civil War.
The primary conflict was between Kublai, who controlled the wealthy Chinese territories, and his younger brother, Arik-Bok, who had remained in the traditional Mongol capital of Karakorum.
And Arik-Bok claimed the title of Great Khan for himself, supported by the traditionalist nomadic factions.
The civil war lasted for years, but Kublai had a massive, insurmountable advantage. He controlled the agrarian wealth of northern China.
He had the bureaucratic infrastructure Yelu Chukai had built to generate endless supplies of grain, silver, and weapons.
Arik-Bok, trapped in the steppe, simply couldn't sustain a protracted war against the economic output of China. Kublai eventually starved his brother into submission.
Having secured his position as the supreme ruler, Kublai made a profound ideological pivot in 1271.
Recognizing that he could not rule a Chinese majority purely as a foreign conqueror, he formally declared the establishment of the Yuan dynasty.
He adopted traditional Chinese imperial rituals, court structures, and bureaucratic titles to legitimize his rule in the eyes of his Han subjects. He claimed the mandate of heaven.
With the civil war settled and his dynasty established, Kublai Khan turned his attention back to the ultimate prize, the total subjugation of the Southern Song.
But the Song were a completely different beast compared to the fractured Jin or the desert-bound Western Xia. They possessed immense geographical advantages and highly advanced military technology.
The geography of southern China is fundamentally hostile to nomadic warfare. The entire region is crisscrossed by lakes, canals, and dense rice paddies,
And the climate is subtropical, hot, and intensely humid.
which was a death sentence for the steppe ponies. They suffered terribly from disease and the lack of proper grazing grass. The terrain completely negated the Mongols' traditional advantages of speed and massed light cavalry.
I mean, you cannot execute a sweeping cavalry charge through a flooded rice paddy.
Exactly. Beyond the geography, the Song had a massive, highly professional standing navy dominating the Yangtze River, and they possessed a terrifying technological edge: gunpowder.
The Song had been iterating on early gunpowder formulas for decades. They mixed saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal to create incendiary and explosive weapons.
The sources extensively detail their use of fire lances in defensive sieges.
These were essentially long bamboo or metal tubes attached to spears.
When ignited, they projected a jet of searing flame, toxic smoke, and shrapnel like ceramic shards or metal debris directly into the faces of attacking troops.
It's essentially a 13th century flamethrower. But they also had weapons that relied on explosive concussion.
Yes, the pinnacle of their defensive technology was the cast-iron thunder crash bomb. Unlike earlier weapons that used paper or bamboo casings to create a loud bang, these bombs used thick, heavy cast-iron shells packed tightly with gunpowder.
So when the fuse reached the powder, the pressure buildup shattered the iron casing.
The resulting explosion produced a deafening concussive shockwave and sent lethal, jagged iron shrapnel tearing through enemy ranks. The Mongols were marching into a highly mechanized, fiercely defended meat grinder.
The strategic key to breaking this massive Song defensive network lay at two heavily fortified twin cities,
Right.
Xianyang and Fancheng.
They sat on opposite banks of the Han River, which was a critical, deep-water tributary that flowed directly into the Yangtze.
The Mongols understood that if they could capture Xianyang, they would control the riverways, and the gateway to the soft underbelly of the Song heartland would be thrown wide open.
Recognizing the stakes, the Mongols initiated a brutal, protracted, incredibly complex siege of Xianyang that would last for 6 grueling years, from 1267 to 1273.
How does a cavalry-based empire besiege a city surrounded by water for 6 years?
By entirely reinventing how they waged war, the Mongols realized they couldn't just starve the city if the Song Navy kept sailing up the river to deliver food.
Right.
So the Mongols built a massive ring of heavily fortified blockhouses entirely encircling the twin cities on land. Then they built a navy.
We are talking about constructing a fleet of roughly 5,000 warships and aggressively training 70,000 infantrymen to serve as riverine marines.
They literally chained ships across the Han River to choke off the water supply routes. They adapted to large-scale naval blockades.
Inside Xianyang, the situation slowly deteriorated. The massive storehouses of grain began to dwindle.
The Song court recognized that if Shenyang fell, the dynasty would likely fall with it, so they launched several desperate, almost suicidal resupply missions to break the blockade.
The most famous of these occurred in 1272. A relatively small Song relief force of roughly 3,000 elite Marines attempted a daring breakthrough.
They utilized a marvel of Song naval engineering: paddle wheel boats.
Let's explain these because this isn't guys with oars.
No, these ships were propelled by large wooden paddle wheels mounted on the sides or the stern of the vessel. Inside the ship, teams of men continuously operated treadmills, walking in place to turn the massive wheels.
This mechanism allowed the ships to move incredibly fast against river currents and maintain speed regardless of the wind direction, making them highly maneuverable in combat.
This relief force launched their attack at night. The sources paint an apocalyptic scene. The paddle wheel boats smashed into the Mongol blockade under the light of raging lantern fires and burning ships.
It devolved into brutal, close-quarters, hand-to-hand combat on the decks of rocking ships.
The combat was so intense that Mongol records explicitly note that on the decks of the ships, the men were fighting up to the ankles in blood.
Good Lord.
Against all odds, a portion of the Song fleet managed to hack their way through the blockade and deliver vital supplies of salt, cloth, and weapons into Shenyang. The historical accounts say the starving citizens leaped up 100 times in joy when the ships arrived.
But the reality was grim. The supplies bought them a few more months of survival, but it didn't break the siege.
The turning point of this massive 6-year standoff didn't come from a battle on the river. It came from thousands of miles away, completely outside of China.
This is where the interconnected nature of the Mongol Empire becomes terrifyingly effective.
Kublai Khan realized that traditional Chinese siege weapons, the traction trebuchets, were not powerful enough to quickly shatter the massive reinforced stone walls of Shenyang.
A traction trebuchet is the older model, right, where you have a long lever arm, a sling on one end, and on the other end you have dozens, so there's hundreds of men simultaneously pulling ropes to swing the arm and throw the rock.
Exactly. The kinetic energy is entirely dependent on human muscle power pulling in perfect unison. They were effective, but their range and payload were limited.
So Kublai Khan sent envoys across the continent to his nephew, the ruler of the Ilkhanate in Persia. He requested the most advanced siege engineers the Islamic world had to offer.
Two highly skilled Muslim engineers, Ismail and Al-Din, traveled thousands of miles across the Silk Road to the Mongol siege camps in China.
And they brought the blueprints for a devastating new weapon. The counterweight trebuchet, recorded in Chinese history as the Hui Hui Bao, or the Muslim trebuchet.
The physics of the counterweight trebuchet fundamentally changed the nature of siege warfare. Instead of relying on men pulling ropes, this machine utilized gravity.
It featured a massive pivoting box filled with tons of lead, stones, or earth attached to the short end of the lever arm.
When the massive weight was released and dropped, it whipped the long end of the arm and the sling attached to it forward with terrifying, consistent velocity.
The specifications of these machines were unprecedented in the Chinese theater of war. The engineers constructed massive wooden frames.
The counterweight trebuchets could hurl immense stone projectiles, weighing anywhere from 165 pounds to over 300 kilograms, over a distance of 500 meters, with pinpoint, repeatable accuracy.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Think about the pure irony of that situation for a moment. The Song dynasty was hiding behind the most advanced defensive walls in human history.
And the Mongols used Islamic engineering, developed in the Middle East and transported across the Eurasian steppe via the logistical network of the empire, to shatter those walls.
They literally harnessed the scientific knowledge of the conquered world and turned it against the last unconquered bastion.
The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. The sources describe the initial bombardment. When these massive 300-kilogram stones hit the towers of Fancheng, they didn't just chip the stone, they completely pulverized the structures.
After Fancheng was reduced to rubble and taken by a bloody assault, the Mongols turned these massive machines directly on Shenyang.
There is a specific account of a stone fired into Jiangyang that hit a stone bridge inside the city. The impact produced a sound like a thunderclap.
When the terrified Song soldiers ran to investigate, they found the massive projectile had punched through the masonry and sunk several feet deep into the solid earth.
Facing that level of unstoppable artillery fire and knowing definitively that no more relief fleets could possibly reach them, the commander of Shenyang, Lu Wenhuan, realized his position was hopeless.
To spare the surviving civilians from a total massacre, he surrendered the city in early 1273.
The fall of Shenyang was the fatal blow. It systematically broke the back of the entire 30-year Song defensive strategy.
The Han River was now completely open, allowing the massive Yuan riverine fleets to sail directly into the Yangtze River.
Once on the Yang side, the Yuan advance was swift, highly organized, and relentless, commanded by the brilliant Mongol general Bayan.
They swept aside the remaining Song River defenses, heading straight toward the magnificent Song capital of Linen, which is modern-day Hangzhou.
By 1276, the Mongol fleets and armies were encamped outside the gates of Linen. The Song court was in absolute despair.
The emperor was just a young boy, Emperor Gong. The acting ruler, the Empress Dowager, faced a horrific decision.
She knew the walls could not withstand the Muslim trebuchets, and she knew the Mongol history of slaughtering cities that forced a siege.
Prioritizing the survival of the city's millions of inhabitants and the physical preservation of the capital over a futile, bloody last stand, the Empress Dowager made the agonizing choice to surrender peacefully.
She formally handed over the imperial seals to General Bayan, effectively surrendering the entire dynasty.
The Mongols marched into Linen, but true to their agreements with surrendered cities under Kublai's new policies, they did not massacre the population.
However, that peaceful surrender was not the end of the war.
It wasn't. A fiercely dedicated faction of Song loyalists, highly placed officials, and military commanders utterly refused to submit to foreign rule.
Before the city officially surrendered, they smuggled two young imperial princes brothers of Emperor Gong out of the capital.
They fled southward, embarking on a grueling, desperate maritime retreat along the jagged southern coast of China, constantly hounded by pursuing UN fleets.
They eventually sought refuge in the Pearl River Delta.
This agonizing retreat sets the stage for the final apocalyptic confrontation of the entire 74-year conquest. We are talking about the Battle of Yamen, fought on March 19, 1279.
The remnants of the Song dynasty, commanded by Admiral Zhang Shiji, found themselves backed into a corner. They had sailed their massive fleet into a narrow, easily defensible bay at Yamen.
The Song fleet was enormous, consisting of roughly 1,000 ships.
But these weren't just warships. This fleet was a floating refugee camp. They had over 200,000 people crammed onto these vessels.
It was the entire surviving royal court, thousands of civil officials, their servants, the soldiers, and the new child emperor, Zhao Bing.
Recognizing that his fleet was burdened by civilians and lacking maneuverability, Admiral Zhang Shiji made a highly controversial tactical decision.
He ordered the entire fleet of 1,000 ships to be heavily chained together, side by side, forming a massive solid crescent formation that completely blocked the inlet of the bay.
He then ordered his men to coat the exterior of the ships with a thick layer of wet mud to defend against the incendiary fire lances and rockets the Mongols might use.
Let's really analyze this decision. Chaining 1,000 ships together into a static floating wooden fortress. On paper, it strips a navy of its fundamental purpose: mobility.
Was this just a catastrophic tactical blunder by a desperate commander?
It's heavily debated. Some military historians view it as a massive blunder because it immobilized his forces. However, others argue it was a rational, desperate calculation.
In what way?
Zhang Shiji knew his crews were exhausted, disease-ridden, and demoralized. If he kept the ships loose, panicked captains might break formation and flee at the first sign of attack.
By chaining them together, he ensured no one could retreat. He created a massive, stable platform for his archers and defensive trebuchets, essentially turning a naval battle into a static siege on water. He was banking on mass and defensive resilience.
But he was facing the Yuan naval commander, Zhang Hongfan. And it is incredibly telling about the nature of the Mongol Empire that the man commanding the final naval assault to destroy the Chinese dynasty was himself a Han Chinese general serving the Mongols.
Zhang Hongfan exploited the Song's immobility with ruthless efficiency. He commanded a much smaller fleet, estimated between 300 and 700 ships.
But his ships were unburdened by civilians, highly maneuverable, and heavily armed with artillery.
He didn't just sail in and attack the chained wall of ships, he used the geography against them.
Right. The Song fleet was chained in the bay, but they still needed resources.
Zhang Hongfan landed detachments of troops on the surrounding shores to capture the Song's wood-cutting and water-gathering camps. He completely severed the chained fleet from their access to fresh water.
The suffering on those chained ships became unimaginable. For nearly 2 weeks, the 200,000 people trapped in the formation had no fresh water.
The soldiers were forced to survive on dry rations and were reduced to drinking seawater, which only induced severe dehydration, vomiting, and dysentery.
The combat effectiveness of the Song forces plummeted.
Once the defenders were sufficiently weakened by thirst and disease, Zhang Hongfan launched the final assault. He utilized the same technological advantage that had broken Xiangyang.
He had mounted counterweight trebuchets on his warships.
The Yuan ships maintained a safe distance, utilizing their superior maneuverability to stay out of range of the Song defenders, and unleashed a sustained, devastating bombardment.
They hurled massive stones and incendiary bombs, targeting the heavy iron chains holding the Song formation together and smashing the outer flanks of the chained line.
Under the relentless artillery fire, the chains finally shattered. The massive, stable crescent formation fractured into chaotic, isolated clusters of battered ships.
The moment the formation broke, Zhang Hongfan signaled his highly mobile assault ships to move in for brutal, close-quarters boarding actions.
The Yuan Marines swarmed the decks of the isolated Song vessels.
The primary sources describe a scene of absolute horrifying panic. As the Yuan troops slaughtered their way across the decks, terrified civilians and officials tried to scramble away.
Overloaded ships, suddenly unchained and destabilized by the shifting weight of panicked crowds, simply capsized, dumping thousands of people into the water. It was a mass slaughter and a mass drowning.
Observing the collapse of the fleet from his command ship, the Song Prime Minister, Lu Zhifu, realized the dynasty had definitively fallen.
He knew that capture meant humiliation and likely execution for the imperial family. He made a devastating final decision.
He dressed the 7-year-old emperor, Zhao Bing, in his finest imperial robes. He tied the heavy imperial seal of the Song dynasty to the boy's waist.
He then took the weeping child in his arms and leaped from the vessel directly into the sea, drowning them both.
That moment is the definitive, tragic end of the Song dynasty. The Battle of Yamen resulted in an estimated 100,000 casualties in a single day.
The sea was reportedly choked with floating bodies and wreckage.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, from a military standpoint, the Battle of Yamen proved the absolute obsolescence of static, chained fleet defense when facing a highly mobile, artillery-equipped hybrid navy.
Politically, with the death of the child emperor, all organized Song resistance evaporated. The mandate of heaven had officially, irrevocably passed to Kublai Khan.
The war was finally over. The map was painted a single color. Kublai Khan now ruled a completely unified China, the first non-Han emperor to do so.
But the aftermath, the reality of living in the wake of a 74-year apocalyptic conflict, was profoundly traumatic.
The demographic devastation, particularly in northern China where the wars against the Jin and Western Xi had raged, is almost difficult to comprehend.
The historical census data reveals a staggering population collapse in the north. Tens of millions of people had vanished due to decades of warfare, deliberate massacres by early Mongol armies,
The total destruction of complex agricultural infrastructure.
and the subsequent famines and plagues that ravaged the ruined landscape.
To manage this vast, battered, and resentful population, the Yuan dynasty implemented a highly structured, rigid system of social control known as the four-class system.
This wasn't just a cultural preference. It was codified law designed to maintain a strict ethnic hierarchy and secure minority Mongol control over a massive Han majority.
At the absolute pinnacle of this system were the Mongols themselves. They held a monopoly on all top-tier military commands, the highest administrative offices, and they enjoyed complete legal immunity from many local laws.
The second tier was the Simu.
Who fell into the Simu category?
Simu roughly translates to people of various categories. This group was comprised of foreigners from the western reaches of the empire, Central Asians, Persians, Uyghurs, and Middle Easterners.
The Mongols deeply distrusted the native Chinese elites, so they imported these foreigners to serve as the critical middle management layer of the empire.
The Simu functioned as tax collectors, financial administrators, and powerful merchants.
Which naturally bred immense resentment among the Chinese population, who saw foreigners brought in to extract their wealth.
Absolutely. The third tier of the system was the Hanren. This category included the millions of northern Chinese, Khitans, and Jurchens who had been conquered decades earlier during the wars against the Jin.
And finally, at the very bottom of the social hierarchy, facing the heaviest taxation and the harshest legal penalties, were the Nanren.
The southern Chinese subjects of the recently conquered Song dynasty, they made up roughly 80% of the empire's population, yet they were systematically excluded from any meaningful political power.
And the Yuan administration utilized the labor of those lower tiers on a staggering scale. They didn't just extract agricultural wealth, they fundamentally reshaped the physical landscape of the empire.
They utilized the system of corvée labor we discussed earlier, drafting millions of peasants to execute massive public works projects.
The most significant of these was the massive extension of the Grand Canal. The original canal systems were designed to move the vast agricultural wealth of the south to the older capitals in the Central Plains.
But Kublai Khan had established his new capital in the far north, at Dadu, modern-day Beijing. To feed his capital, he drafted millions of laborers to dig new canals, physically linking the Yangtze River Valley directly to Beijing, ensuring a constant flow of millions of tons of grain northward.
They also utilized massive amounts of labor to establish and maintain the Yam postal system. This was the logistical nervous system of the Mongol Empire.
It was an incredible feat of organization. The Yam was a vast, interconnected network of relay stations spaced approximately every 25 to 30 miles across the entirety of the empire.
Each station was heavily stocked with fresh horses, fodder, food, and shelter, maintained by the forced labor of the local villages.
A Mongol messenger carrying an imperial medallion of paitsa could ride a horse to exhaustion, arrive at a Yam station, instantly transfer to a fresh horse, and continue riding without stopping to rest.
Using this system, vital military intelligence or imperial decrees could travel up to 200 miles in a single day.
It allowed the emperor in Beijing to maintain relatively rapid communication with commanders on the borders of Vietnam or the steppes of Central Asia.
Despite the rigid hierarchy and the heavy burdens placed on the peasantry, there is a distinct contrast in how the Yuan dynasty treated the defeated royal families compared to the early years of the conquest.
We talked about how Genghis Khan completely butchered the Western Shia royalty and how the Jin emperor was driven to suicide. But Kublai Khan's treatment of the Southern Song royal family was surprisingly pragmatic and lenient.
It reflects the shift from a culture of annihilation to a culture of governance. Emperor Gong of Song, the young boy who had peacefully surrendered at Lenin, was not executed.
He was spared, sent to Tibet, and allowed to study Buddhism, eventually becoming a highly respected monk. The historical sources even note that he was married to a Mongol princess from the royal Borjigin family.
Kublai spared the civilians in the southern capital and actively rehired thousands of lower-level Southern Song administrative officials into the Yuan bureaucracy. He understood that he needed their institutional knowledge to keep the complex economy of the South functioning.
But not everyone accepted this new reality. The surrender of Lenin and the disaster at Yamen triggered a massive wave of political refugees.
Many deeply committed Southern Song loyalists, highly educated scholars, and military officers refused to live under the rigid four-class system. They fled overseas.
A significant number of these exiles fled south into Vietnam, seeking refuge with the local Tran dynasty. They brought with them advanced administrative knowledge, military expertise, and a deep, burning hatred for the Mongols.
And they actually got their chance for revenge. When Kublai Khan subsequently launched massive naval invasions attempting to conquer Vietnam, these Chinese exiles actively integrated with the Vietnamese forces.
They provided crucial intelligence and tactical advice, helping the Vietnamese successfully repel the Mongol invasions and preserve their independence.
It highlights the complex legacy of the Yuan dynasty. On one hand, the Pax Mongolica facilitated an incredible era of Eurasian exchange.
By securing the Silk Road, they allowed technologies, goods, and people, most famously Marco Polo, to travel safely from Europe and the Middle East all the way to the court in Beijing. They cross-pollinated the knowledge of two hemispheres.
But simultaneously, the harsh realities of their governance, the strict ethnic hierarchies that alienated the elite, the ruthless exploitation of resources, and the massive exhausting labor levies placed upon the peasantry to build canals and fleets, laid the deep groundwork for their eventual downfall.
The policies that allowed them to efficiently extract wealth and maintain rigid control in the short term created the exact friction that would explode into the massive Red Turban rebellions, leading to the total collapse of the Yuan dynasty less than a century later.
It is the ultimate paradox of their empire. The administrative tools that made them wealthy enough to rule also sowed the seeds of their own destruction.
Which leaves us with a deeply compelling, final philosophical question to ponder.
We started this deep dive looking at how a nomadic steppe army managed to conquer the most advanced agrarian society on Earth. But when you look at the aftermath, the complex tax codes, the reliance on massive hydraulic engineering, the construction of colossal naval fleets, and the heavy bureaucracy required to manage it all, did the Mongols truly conquer China? Or did the staggering administrative, logistical, and technological requirements of ruling such a vast, sedentary society fundamentally dissolve the Mongols' own nomadic identity?
By the end of the 74-year process, the Yuan dynasty was fielding navies of thousands of ships and drowning in paperwork.
They had effectively transformed into the exact type of bureaucratic, heavily taxed, sedentary empire their ancestors had so violently despised. It makes you wonder, in the grand sweep of history, who really absorbed who?
It really does.
Thank you for listening. History Maps.
Yeah.
Learn history visually.